people used to ask me how it is that we have an opera company in this slightly weird place and a beautiful little theater in this strange place where perhaps one would least expect to find either a theater or an opera company. And the story of how it all came to be, I think, is fascinating and interesting, and it's something that I keep investigating all the time and learning more and more about it. The name of this organization is the Central City Opera House Association. And it's called that because the organization was founded to save, restore, preserve, and use this building. Some opera companies come into being and then they buy a theater or they build a theater if they're lucky, or somehow. The theater came first in our case. Now, how did the theater come to be? For that, to understand that, we have to go back to the year 1859, when the first gold strikes occurred just down the hill, a little way past the post office, on the way to Black Hawk. There had been a false alarm of gold strikes at Pikes Peak. That all turned out to be a fraud. The slogan Pikes Peak or bust was mostly bust. And the people who went to Pikes Peak mostly returned home very discouraged. Some of them stayed around here in Golden, which was then a tent city. Denver was a tent city also. And some of them tried prospecting Clear Creek, which is, if you go down Route 6, the little stream that goes past the road there is Clear Creek. One of these miners was from Georgia. His name was John Gregory. And he had prospected for gold in northern Georgia. But at that time, in the 1850s, the gold fields in northern Georgia were beginning to play out. And some of those gold-infected people came west, hoping to try their luck here. This was 10 years after the big gold strikes in California, and gold fever was rampant throughout the United States. John Gregory and a group of his friends started working their way up Clear Creek because they were finding gold. They were doing placer mining, panning, and they kept finding gold in the stream, and they worked their way up the stream hoping to find the source of the gold. At the bottom of the hill here, where Route 6 goes one way and 119 begins, we call that Forks of Creek. Some of them went straight west on towards what we now call Idaho Springs, still looking for gold. And John Gregory and a few others started north, up the north branch of Clear Creek. And some of them stopped along the way, and Gregory continued on because he kept finding gold. And he got to a place where another little creek, we now call Eureka Creek, and it runs under the foundry. This creek was running in, and he thought he would try his luck up there, and then he saw a rock outcropping that he thought looked kind of familiar, and struck a fabulously rich vein of gold. And of course, the word got, he tried to keep it a secret, but there was no way of keeping it a secret. Within months, there were 2,000 people in the area between Central City and Black Hawk, all around what is called the Gregory Diggings. There was so much gold, it was sticking up out of the ground. You could literally stumble over a fortune. And of course, everybody went to work right away, and fortunes were made overnight, and in most cases spent just as quickly. Within a short time, the surface gold was exhausted, and they had to start digging, going underground for the gold. And as they got farther and farther down underground, they encountered hard rock, and they didn't know how to deal with that. And so their solution was to import a number of miners from Wales, people who had worked the coal mines there, and Cornwall, miners who had worked the tin mines. The Cornish and the Welsh came over here and showed the then miners how to do the deep rock mining, and they stayed. They brought their families over. The Cornish built walls everywhere of stone, walls that in many cases are still standing a century and a half later without mortar. And we're indebted, sometimes you can take a walk and see way up on the hillside a wall, a Cornish wall. Of course, they're all over Central City, and some of them have been rebuilt. Every once in a while there's a collapse because now people water lawns, and the water gets behind and pushes the stone out. They weren't watering lawns then. They were busy mining. The Welsh have wonderful voices. We know from some opera stars of today, from Wales. In Wales, the men form choral societies. There are choral societies everywhere. Well, when they came over here, they decided to form their choral societies here in Central City also. And they gave concerts. They gave them in a theater called the Montana Theater, which was a little way down past the intersection of Lawrence Street and Main Street. In 1874, there was a horrendous fire which consumed all of the business district of Central City, including the Montana Theater. And then the poor Welsh and Cornish who wanted to do their amateur theatricals and their choral concerts and everything else decided they had to have something else. A theater called the Belvedere, which still is there, was built, and it's, you know, where Annie Oakley's convenience store is, and just past that is a building which is not in use at the present time, although there have been several attempts made to restore it, the Belvedere Theater. And that became the place for concerts and plays. And operas. The locals would put on operas, and they were fazed by nothing. I saw a notice for Il Trovatore, which the locals did, and they probably had a band of, 6 players of various assorted instruments. The Manrico was sung by a man named William Bush, who was the first manager of the Teller House and whom Horace Tabor later lured to Leadville to manage the Clarendon Hotel, and who was the person who introduced Baby Doe to Horace Tabor. See, it's all linked together. And it's just one big linkage here. The line in Face on the Barroom Floor, there's a tale behind everything out here, and you can believe it. There is a story behind everything. Anyway, one year, 1876, the miners got together and they produced an opera called The Bohemian Girl. Some of you may be familiar with that. I dreamt I dwelt in marble halls, the soprano number. The Bohemian Girl was such a tremendous success and had a long run in the Belvedere that they decided that they needed to have a proper theater in which to do their theatricals. And they thought so much about this that they even went out and hired a bona fide architect to design a building for them. His name was William Rochlaub, and he has a chair. Well, this chair used to be somewhere over there. I don't know where it is now with the new seating. If you know Denver at all, the Trinity Methodist Church downtown, beautiful church on Broadway, is his masterpiece. He was an excellent architect. And he also designed a number of the schools in Denver. He had designed a couple of theaters, but he put a lot of thought and work into this one. Money for the building was raised by public subscription. It was the citizens of Central City who paid for this building, not a gold king or a silver king, which was the case in many western towns. It was owned by the city. And a man named Peter McFarland, who had a construction company and who also owned a foundry where he manufactured mining equipment, and that's where we do our rehearsing now, did all the heavy construction on the building. Miners, after they got through with their work in the mine, would come up and volunteer, and they helped build the place too, because they thought so much of this building that was going up. Peter McFarland later became a mayor of Central City, and he enters very much into our history in more ways than one. The building opened in 1878. It was a great success. In 1879, at the height of Central City's wealth, and there was plenty of it, and fame as the richest square mile on earth, 1879 was the year of the silver strikes in Leadville, and half of the population here moved west to strike it rich in silver. And that was the beginning of a very, very slow decline in all ways for Central City. The population kept getting smaller and smaller. The gold mines had been getting deeper and deeper and deeper, and it was becoming more and more difficult and expensive to get the gold out. By the turn of the century, the remaining population was very dispirited. People weren't coming to this theater anymore. The organization which had been formed to run the theater, an organization called the Gilpin County Opera Association, decided to give up on the building, and the county bought this theater to turn it into a courthouse. Well, the remaining population of Central City was up in arms that their theater should be desecrated and reused for something else. So they banded together and had the city buy back this building. The city of Central bought the building back from the county, and eventually the county built the big courthouse across the street, catty corner. But it was almost here. Peter McFarland loved this building. He quietly bought up all the shares that were stockholders, the shares of the Gilpin County Opera Association, so that in effect he owned this building. He reopened it and tried bringing traveling plays here. There was something called the Silver Circuit at that time. Plays would travel throughout the West. They would travel with actors, props, and costumes, no scenery. And every theater had its set of drops. There was the Garden drop, there was the Seaside drop, there was the Village Square drop, and they all rolled up. They were oilcloth. And the audience accepted this. They accepted that one night they could see Romeo and Juliet, because a lot of Shakespeare was played. They could see Romeo and Juliet one night and see Our Country Cousin in front of the same drops the next night. Didn't bother them. When Horace Tabor built his opera house in Leadville, it was a little bigger than this one, because and as a matter of fact, if you have the chance to go to Leadville, do and look at the theater, because it is like this opera house was in the 1870s, except bigger, because for Horace Tabor, everything had to be bigger. Plays were going there, and they were bypassing Central City at the time. And then when Tabor built the Tabor Grand in Denver, that was almost the death knell for Central City, because also it was a very hard place to get to. Central City would have been the capital of Colorado in the 1860s, except that it was just too difficult to get here. At the time, you had to come through up the creek with burros, and eventually some kind of rough road was sketched out so they could use stagecoaches. The road that we travel through the canyon, Route 6, did not exist. Nothing existed there until railroad rails were put down, and then there was a train that actually came from Denver to Black Hawk, and then there was a spur that came up to Central City. In the late 40s, the train was discontinued, and that road was put down. Most of it is on the old rail bed. Central City, early 1900s, was a desolate-looking place. It wasn't a ghost town, but it wasn't too far from it. Peter McFarlane tried to keep the theater going. His picture, we have a rogues gallery in the lobby that you should look at sometime. His picture is out there. Some of those pictures were very difficult to find. He didn't like to have his picture taken, like Emily. But I tracked one down at the University of Wyoming. He tried to keep the theater going, but there were fewer and fewer people to come. When silent movies came in, he tried showing movies in here. He would let the kids in on Saturday for free, but nothing worked. And finally, discouraged, Peter McFarlane closed the building in 1927. He died in 1929. And the building was deserted. Some people wanted to buy it to turn it into a garage and blacksmith shop. But the heirs of Peter McFarlane, his son Fred, and Fred's wife Ida Cruz, would not allow that to happen. Ida Cruz McFarlane had grown up in Central City, and she thought that this building was something very special. By the early 30s, she was a member of the English department at Denver University, DU. And she thought this theater would just be wonderful if it were restored and could be used to perform the plays of Shakespeare and other classic writers. That was her vision, but she had no wherewithal. Fred McFarlane lived in Denver then. The foundry was closed, and McFarlane and Company really didn't exist very much anymore. However, Ida Cruz McFarlane made the acquaintance of a woman named Ann Evans. Ann Evans was the daughter of John Evans, who had been a governor of Colorado, who had been one of the founders of Denver University, who before that had been a founder of Northwestern University, which is located, as you know, in Evanston, Illinois. John Evans was very high in the social register. So his daughter, Ann Evans, who was a rather homely maiden lady with a lot of pizzazz, nevertheless, Ann Evans had the social cachet, and Ida Cruz had the energy, and the two of them got together and cooked up the idea of the Central City Opera House Association. They enlisted the aid of a married couple, Delos Chappelle and his wife, Edna. Delos Chappelle was a Broadway producer. He had connections to Broadway. His wife was an actress. She knew a lot of people in the theater also. They lived in Denver. And the artist Alan True. The 5 of them were the charter members of the Central City Opera House Association. They got together, they came up here, they came up here with Ann Evans, who had never been up here before, and walked into this building, padlocked in the front door, and saw that most of the ceiling was on the floor, that rats and skunks and all kinds of squirrels and pigeons had had their way with the building. It was full of cobwebs. It was a total mess. And Ann Evans looked at it and she said, "Ida, you're out of your mind." But they went back to Denver and wondered what they could do and how they could raise the money. This was in the early 30s. This was 1930, as a matter of fact, which was a year after the big crash. And the United States was in the first throes of the Great Depression, and very few people had money, even in the West. So they decided to go after the Denver businessmen, using Ann Evans as their front man, as it were. She became very famous on 17th Street in Denver, the Wall Street of Denver, going up and down the street in her sensible shoes, buttonholing all the businessmen, and it got to the point when they saw her coming, they didn't even fight. They would just take out their checkbooks. She thought of several ways to raise money. One of them was to sell dedications on chairs in the opera house. There were no seats either. There were a few hickory chairs left. Some of them still exist. Joshua collapsed one yesterday. For $100, if you had a Colorado pioneer ancestor, you could have their name inscribed on the chair and the date of their arrival in Colorado. Now, see, all those names and dates were transferred to this new seating. They're all still there. The date is not the birth date, it's the date of arrival in Colorado. And Ann Evans decided this was not going to be a Shakespeare festival. It was going to be a pioneer festival honoring the Colorado pioneers. And the theater was going to be a monument to the Colorado pioneers. So they were selling chairs for $100 each, or selling dedications on them, and genealogies were researched very thoroughly. After a while, they ran out of Colorado pioneers, and they still wanted money. So they decided that you could purchase a dedication honoring somebody who had been prominent in the arts, performing arts, like Sarah Bernhardt. There's a Sarah Bernhardt chair is somewhere. Or a person who had been a performer in this theater. There's a Helen Hayes chair somewhere. There's a Beverly Sills chair. There's all kinds of things. There are still lots of chairs available. They cost $5,000 now if anybody would like to invest. Dolores Chappelle, the Broadway guy, called his friend Robert Edmund Jones, designer, director, who was at the top of his form in the 20s in New York. Very famous man whose writings now have become of interest again to young designers. And they brought Jones out here. Jones had a wonderful phrase for everything. They brought him out here and marched him into the theater and said, "We would like to have a play festival here, Mr. Jones, in this theater." And he looked at the cobwebs and the broken chairs and the plaster on the floor and everything else, and he said, "Why, this is perfect." Of course, there was nothing. There was no curtain. There was no chandelier. There was nothing. But he got all fired up, and he went back to New York, and he called his friend Lillian Gish. And he said, "Lillian, how would you like to do Camille in a ghost theater in a ghost town in the Rocky Mountains?" And her answer supposedly was, "Well, I'll have to think about that." And she put the phone down and turned to her sister and said, "I didn't know Mr. Jones drank." But the wheels were in motion. They raised the money. They somehow got the ceiling back up. They made new hickory chairs for the people to sit in. They used, not this carpet, but carpeting out of the Windsor Hotel in Denver, which was being demolished at the time, to carpet the theater. They put the whole thing together. Mr. Robert Edmond Jones designed a house curtain, which he thought would be in the manner of the house curtains of 19th century Victorian theaters, using some of the motifs from the ceiling. And it was painted by a man named Pancho Gates, who died only a few years ago at the age of 90-some, who remained in Central City all the time. The idea of producing plays, or a play, in this theater in the Rocky Mountains in the early 1930s was so improbable that it caught the national imagination, and we had publicity all over the country for this impossible festival that was going to happen. We have clippings from everywhere. I mean, Brockton, Massachusetts, and little towns in Minnesota, and Seattle, everywhere, ran pictures and long articles on the fact that Lillian Gish, herself in person, was going to come here to perform in this restored theater. It was 1932, the birth of the Central City Opera House Association, and we're still here. The festival during its first 10 years was a great success, and Mr. Jones was here a great deal. He was here most seasons and was, in effect, the first artistic director of the association. He brought in other stage directors like Herbert Graf, who had been one of the refugees from Nazi Europe, and a musical director named Frank St. Ledger, who became a very important person in our history. In 1941, the last festival season before World War II happened. And then the theater closed during the war. People were not supposed to travel unnecessarily. Gasoline was rationed, tires were rationed, and so there was no festival during those years. However, there was a big reopening in 1946 after the war. By that time, Ida Cruz McFarland had died. Ann Evans had died. As a matter of fact, Ann Evans died in 1940. She was sick and on the way out as The Barded Bride was being performed in this theater, and she listened to it over the telephone. Very sad. The new person running this place was named Frank Richardson. Frank Richardson was a dynamic personality. He was the agent for Fox Theaters in the entire Rocky Mountain region, and he managed a bunch of theaters in Denver. He made a fortune selling popcorn in movie theaters. It was a novel idea. Yes. And also he invented something called bank night in the Depression, where they would raffle off. It started out very modestly, but it got to the point where they were raffling off automobiles and houses even, to get people into the theaters. He took this place over, and he didn't know anything about opera, but he knew what he didn't know. He was that smart, and he relied on advice from other people, and it was mostly very good advice, and mostly from Frank St. Ledger, who had been conducting here in the 30s, but in the 40s, St. Ledger, the late 40s, became artistic administrator at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and was hearing all, that was in the Johnson administration there, hearing all the auditions of the young singers. And it happened that every time when they heard a singer who was very promising and who needed stage experience, St. Ledger would send them out here. And thereby began what has become a very important part of the mission of Central City Opera, which is the discovery, the development, and the promotion of young talent, particularly young American talent. No, it's all right. You're included, Mark. And so it would happen that a young singer, age 24, who was very promising, had no stage experience, was sent out here to get some stage experience. His name was Jerome Hines. In 1946, in the first festival, abduction from the Seraglio. Later he came back and sang Tales of Hoffmann on this stage. And a long string of young singers came out here who had auditioned for the Met, and St. Ledger pointed them in this direction for experience. James McCracken, Cornell McNeil. If you go through the dressing rooms and look at the pictures on the wall and look at the names, it's a who's who of opera in America in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. Then it picks up again later. Mr. Richardson, well, before going on, we say Richardson was still at the helm in 1963, and there's a famous billboard over in the stables, which I like to point out to people. The season was Trovatore and Don Giovanni. The title role in Don Giovanni was shared by Richard Cross, who was back with us this summer. Richard Cross and Norman Treigle, who got a lot of his early experience here also. Spiro Malas was very early in his career doing Leporello. John McCurdy as the Commendatore, and also sharing the role was Justino Diaz with his first real job. Mazzetto was Cheryl Milnes, way back at the beginning of his career, and Sam Raimi was in the chorus. Trovatore had Lucina Mara and Richard Castley and a whole bunch of other people. Go look at that billboard. It's stunning to see all those names. What many people do not realize is that, and I pointed this out to the board at the meeting last week, is that many of the names on those billboards that we have, many of those names were not household names when those billboards went up in front of the theater. They were unknowns. Some of them were slightly known. Stieber wasn't exactly an unknown, but she had not reached the peak of her career by any means. Sang here twice in the 50s, in the 40s. Yes, so that by default, well, it wasn't exactly by default, but it was almost by accident that this interest in young American talent was started and nurtured through the years here at Central City. It became a very important part of the whole company. St. Ledger in New York was also sending stage directors and conductors out here, refugees from Europe, who had all flocked to New York looking for work. Mostly they were escaping the Nazi regimes from the 30s. And he sent them out here. So these young singers had experienced conductors and coaches and stage directors to work with and with development. When New York City Opera was founded, if you look at the roster of New York City Opera in the early years, it looks like a Central City Opera roster from a few years before then. The company continued to prosper and thrive under Richardson until he stepped down. He stepped down in 1964. 1964 is a bad date for us because we lost, well, we didn't lose him. I mean, he was still alive. He became chairman of the board, but that was then a very honorary position. He wasn't running the company anymore. When he was running it, he ran everything with an iron hand, and he was famous for coming into rehearsals in the theater with a stopwatch and telling conductors if something ran too long, he would say to the conductor, "It has to be cut." And if the conductor objected, Mr. Richardson would say, "It's going to be cut. Are you going to cut it, or do you want me to cut it?" In the mid-50s, Mr. Richardson decided that we needed to commission an opera, and he had settled on the story of Baby Doe, and he had a meeting of the executive committee in Denver. Former member of that committee told the story that he had them all gathered together, and he told them all about this Baby Doe and all that. And he said, now we need to take a vote. And the vote was no. So he said, well, we're going to do this commission. Now, should we have another vote? And the vote was a unanimous yes. But when he stepped down, he stepped down at a time when no successor had been groomed. The board had been mostly the same people since the 30s. They had not groomed successors. Some of them were getting burned out. They were aging. Some of them had died. And there was no one to take Mr. Richardson's place, really. The company floundered. They tried one thing after another. One year they brought William Gish back to do a speech or a whole evening of talking about D.W. Griffith. They brought in D'Oyly Carte Company twice. They'd tried this, they tried that, they tried the other thing, but nothing was working. They tried everything except establishing a good, firm organization with first-class productions. And they just didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to do it. They were well-meaning people, and in a way, we have to be grateful to them for keeping the thing going during those tough years. In 1972, a deficit, what we call accumulated deficit, was begun because of overspending. Began in 1972 and kept getting bigger and bigger every year. It was carried over from year to year. Notes with the banks were renewed until finally, by 1981, it had reached $644,000, which doesn't seem so awful right now, but in 1981, that was a lot of money. And the debt service, the interest that they were paying to the banks on that money in 1980, you probably don't remember, but interest was very, very high. It was double-digit interest. What they were paying in interest was enough to be able to mount another production in the theater. Robert Darling was named artistic director in 1978, and he tried to improve the quality of productions here, brought good people in, but he was not able to do anything about this deficit, which just kept getting bigger and bigger. And in 1981, the board voted to cancel the 82 season. Some of them wanted to sell off all the assets and call it quits. The rats were leaving the sinking ship very quickly. One of them being what is called the Golden Rose, is closed now on the corner where they're going to put a casino again. And the Knights of Pythias warehouse, which was falling down, and the building across the street from the Golden Rose, the bank building, we called it. It's empty now. Doc Holliday Casino was in there. They sold off those three buildings. They effected a 30-year lease on the Teller House to Cornerstone Properties in Boulder and raffled off one of the houses, one of the residence houses, and retired the debt that way. As when they asked me to take over the company, and I thought, oh, boy, well, it will be interesting. I'll do it for a year or two and see if I can turn things around. 16 years later was when I decided it was time to, I'd had my 1 or 2 years of fun. But and we reopened in 1983. We reopened a theater, this theater. The back wall was falling down, had to be braced up with all kinds of cast iron. All the residence houses were an incredible mess you cannot imagine, with leaking roofs, water coming through the ceilings, where, you know, the only solution was move the bed over, get away from the leak. Things were in horrible, horrible shape. And I discovered also that there was no inventory in the theater. We had a building, and we had a house curtain, and we had a light board which had been sent up here from Denver by Mr. Richardson, that taken out of the Broadway theater when that was demolished. Technology of the 20s with those old rheostat handles. That's what we had. Nothing else. No lighting instruments, no cable, no sewing machines in the costume shop. No, they rented everything every year, because I always figured, well, it was during that bad period, we may not be doing this next year, so we'll just rent. They even rented flat irons. They rented everything. So part of the job then was to build up this whole thing. If I had told the board what I intended to do, they would have fired me right away. But the long restoration, new restoration began, of the rewiring of the theater, everything, nearly everything you see, and a lot of stuff you don't see, is new. Things were going along rather shakily first years, and then in the second season, part of the ceiling fell in during a performance. A large part of plaster, about 6 by 4, came down from the ceiling, hit the edge, fortunately, hit the edge of the balcony rail and shattered. Otherwise, it would have killed somebody, and then we would have been out of business for real. So that had to be taken care of. It was almost the end of the season then, and we canceled one performance. Oh, it was during the performance of Cinderella, of all things. Robert Orth had just finished his aria, the Dandini aria in the first act, and plop, down it came. And Grant Wilson was on the stage too, and he just couldn't imagine what was going on. So, of course, we had to empty the theater right away. We invited everyone to go down to the Teller House, and all the singers went down and sang arias the rest of the night. And some of the people thought it was better than the show. But there we were. We had one more week to go, and we couldn't afford to refund money. We had to cancel the Sunday afternoon matinee the next day. And the next scheduled performance in this theater was a youth performance. And so we had the plaster specialists in and the architects and crawling all over the place, who assured us that the rest of the ceiling was not going to fall down. We put netting across there, and to prove how confident we were, we went ahead with the youth performance with this theater full of children. And it worked. It worked, although I was sitting up there in my seat at the top of the balcony holding my breath. The 85 season, we played, and every time when I was not conducting, I was up there watching the ceiling instead of the stage. We could not guarantee that the rest of the ceiling would not come down eventually. So it had to come down. It was demolished, but before it was demolished, it was photographed, it was measured, it was stenciled. There were pieces of it cut out and put between two pieces of plywood and carried down to Denver, and layers of varnish and grime and everything else were removed in order to find the original colors. We played 86 season with a white plaster ceiling. 87 season, the new murals, restored murals, were up. They are not painted on the ceiling anymore. They were painted on canvas, pieces of canvas, and then glued in place, so that if we have any more roof leaks, a section can be taken down, the plaster repaired, and then that glued back. These are the true colors which had not been seen since 1878, because the original chandelier was a gas chandelier, and as soon as the theater opened, grime started covering up the colors. There was detail in the ceiling that we didn't even know existed. A lot of the stuff in the corners, for example. We didn't know that there was a sky there, and those cross lines that are supposedly supporting the chandelier, we didn't know that was all there. It was painted by an artist from San Francisco named John Massman. Some people think also he may have done the ceiling across the street in St. James Methodist Church. The style is similar, although I don't think it's as good looking as these. And he also did these murals, the horses on the side, which when they're lit properly look very three-dimensional. The houses had to be fixed up eventually, but there was no point in dealing with the houses when the theater itself was falling down. The theater had to be looked at first, and eventually we did get around to the houses. Since Harley has been here, the renewal of the houses has been phenomenal. He's done an awful lot of work, and you really owe him a great deal for these places that you're living in if you're living in town. And also the ladies of the Guild have done an awful lot of work on the properties. We rewired the theater. We enlarged the pit way back as far as it'll go into the mountain. We can't go any farther without blasting, and then the whole thing will come down. The final solution for the back wall of the theater was to build a new back wall around it, because even braced up, it was leaking all the time. So you see there's a jog if you look at the back of the theater there. Over the years, we've done all kinds of things, enlarged the shop, put in new bathrooms. For a while, I was doing diction classes in the ladies' bathroom. It surprised a lot of people who happened to be wandering on the street and came in to use the bathroom. The men had no bathroom until a few years ago. They'd have to go behind the bushes. That was all part of a big renewal of the theater. And then gambling came to town. We had been selling out the entire season in a theater that had 200 more seats than we have now for 4 years in a row. First year of gambling, we lost about 20% of our audience because a lot of people were afraid to come up here, afraid of drunks on the road, or they didn't like what was happening to Central City, or, you know, there's a lot of that. No offense. So it was kind of discouraging at first, but we eventually built it back. In 1983, when we reopened the theater, we had a big rebuilding job to do because we had to rebuild the confidence of the people in Denver who gave money. Nobody likes to throw money down a rat hole, and if the company is spending $100,000 a year in debt service and interest, nobody wants to fund that. So we had to rebuild that confidence, and we had to rebuild the subscriber base, and we had to rebuild the general attendance and let people know that we were serious. We did all kinds of things. We started doing, it was traditional here to do 2 operas. We did 2 operas and an operetta to entice people up the hill and to make sure that they knew that we were serious. We took those operettas on a tour, which Jeffrey will remember. People were ready to kill me. We would do 4 performances in Denver, 2 in Colorado Springs, and 2 in Fort Collins, the whole company. We took operettas because they were the only pieces that would fit into, where the orchestra would fit into the pit in those places. And it worked, because there were a lot of new people in Denver at that time who didn't know what we were, or who thought that maybe you know, with some bunch of amateurs up in that funky mountain town, just getting together and having fun. All this time we were developing the training program, and there had been sort of, there had been apprentices here before. When I was down in Santa Fe, we used to sometimes try to lure people from here down to there, because at that time Santa Fe was the upstart young company down there. But there had never been a formalized training program, and that was one of the things that we started in 1978, a formalized training program, and have continued through the years. And have always continued that search for young talent. A lot of people began their careers here. Among them, of course, Catherine Malfitano, who did her first job here. And I first met Catherine in 1973 in Wolf Trap. In 72, she was singing Nanetta. In 73, she was already singing Anina in The Saint of Bleecker Street, which was a big leap. Where is she? I saw her come in somewhere. Yes. Right. And those billboards from that period are in the dance studio. You see Miss Malfitano's name there on one of the billboards. So, but at the time that billboard went up, nobody knew who Catherine Malfitano was. It's the case with so many of those. By the time 1998 it came around, I was beginning to feel that it was time to step down. And we had the good fortune to engage Pat Pierce 2 years before as managing director. And he was the obvious choice for a nice, smooth succession. And it was one of the best decisions that I was very active with the board at the time, that I and the board ever made. Because he not only took over seamlessly, but built on everything that we had tried to put back together since 1983, and has gone on far beyond what anyone imagined could happen in such a short time. And among other things, two important things: the expansion of the repertory, which was not possible in the 80s because we had to be sure that we were selling out everything, and also national recognition, something which the company had not had since the 60s, really. At that time when Mr. Richardson was running things and the board was pretty much the same every year, they got very, very complacent up here. Central City had been it for so long that they didn't realize that the festival here was established at a time when nothing was going on in the country during the summer. Of course, people came out here because there was no place else to go. This was after the war when it was possible to travel again. And when companies like Santa Fe Opera, for example, started up, I thought, well, this down there, it's not going to affect our audience. And as opera companies and festivals of all kinds started springing up all over the country, they ignored that. They just sat back and thought that because they were number one, they were always going to remain number one. Well, it doesn't happen that way, because other people just overtake you. Now we are back in the first tier of summer festivals. We are the 5th oldest opera performing organization in the United States, and we're very proud of that. Unfortunately, we're not the oldest summer festival. Chautauqua beat us by 2 years. But for a United States company, 5th oldest is a pretty good record. But here we are in this weird place, as I said, 146 years after the gold strikes, 127 years after the building of the theater, 73 years after the establishment of the Central City Opera House Association. And we can look back on this range of history and say, what a remarkable, what a wonderful thing this has been for us and for the people who come to enjoy our performances. We're indebted to the Welsh and the Cornish for what they did in bringing the arts into this mountain town in the early years. We're certainly indebted to Ann Evans and Ida Cruz McFarlane and those visionaries who in the 1930s saved this building for us. And to the people who have kept the Opera Association, the Opera House Association going all these years, so that we can come here and indulge in our art and enjoy it and do our best and enjoy being in the kind of company that Central City Opera always has been. You know, the first time I came here, after working in a number of different places, I got here and I thought, this place is different. I felt, even that very first season of mine in 1978, very much at home already because of the closeness of the company. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we all live so close together and we see each other and we work together all the time and we dine together and party together and all of that. The Central City Opera is very special. And most people who have been here always look back on their summer or summers in Central as something they never want to forget and that they would like to repeat. And I hope that that will be the case with all of you again this summer, that you will look back on this experience and say, boy, that was one of the best summers of my life. Thanks.